I nursed a puppy back to health and adopted him. He quickly became my best friend, but then one day he went missing. When I finally found him, he was in terrible condition, suffering from a life-threatening disease. As a veterinarian, I've seen my share of heart-wrenching cases, but this one hit particularly close to home. It all began when, at the end of a long day, as I was getting ready to head home, a staff member brought in a large trash bag. When she opened it, I was horrified to see a tiny puppy inside. "We found him in a dumpster just like this," she explained. The poor pup was severely malnourished, with infected wounds, broken bones, and a dangerously low body temperature. But despite his dire condition, he was still clinging to life. I knew I had to act fast. I rushed him into the operating room and began performing surgery. The procedure was incredibly challenging, but by some miracle, it was successful. Over the next few days, I dedicated myself to his care, and during that time, a strong bond formed between us. He began to wag his tail weakly whenever I approached, and the first time he licked my face after I fed him, I knew I couldn't let him go. That day, I took him home and named him Zeus. I prepared a special little corner for Zeus in my living room, complete with a cozy red and green bed that had his name embroidered on it, and a basket of toys beside it. But the moment we walked through the door, it became clear that Zeus had other plans. He barked and cried whenever I tried to settle him in his corner at night. He wanted to be wherever I was. If I was in the kitchen, he was there beside me. If I sat on the couch, he'd snuggle up next to me. And when it was time for bed, he would completely ignore his cozy corner, choosing instead to sleep at the foot of my bed, keeping a watchful eye on me. The first time I had to leave him alone to go to work, I was a nervous wreck. I knew he was safe at home, but I couldn't stop worrying about him all day. As soon as my shift ended, I rushed home, only to find Zeus waiting eagerly at the door, his tail wagging furiously as if to say, "Where have you been from that day on?" He greeted me at the door every evening, no matter how stressful my day had been. Seeing Zeus always made everything better. As Zeus continued to heal, his energy levels grew. Soon he was bounding around the house like any happy puppy should. It was a joy to see him so full of life, though his newfound energy also came with a strong sense of curiosity. He would sometimes dig through the trash can, or rummage through my closet, rearranging my shoes in the process. But I understood he was exploring the world with this new strength he had gained. Watching Zeus transform from a fragile, injured pup to a lively, curious companion was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. He became more than just a pet. He was a loyal friend who filled my days with happiness and my home with love. I knew Zeus needed an outlet for all his energy, so we started going to the park together. Zeus absolutely loved it. He would chase after squirrels, play with other dogs, and run circles around me until we were both exhausted. Watching him enjoy himself so much was incredible, a true testament to how far he had come. However, there was one incident that stands out in my memory, and it wasn't a pleasant one. Zeus was a very friendly dog, and he often got overly excited when I threw a ball for him to fetch. Sometimes in his excitement, he would fail to slow down in time and accidentally crash into the shins of nearby pedestrians. Most people didn't mind. They would pet him, laugh, or glance up at me with a smile, signaling what a cute dog he was. But there was one time when Zeus crashed into the wrong person. As he lightly bumped into a woman's leg, she immediately reacted by trying to kick him, not once, but twice. The second kick connected, and I heard Zeus yelp in pain. I rushed over, furious, and confronted her, demanding to know what was wrong with her. She started yelling back at me, insisting that I needed to put the dog down because he couldn't behave properly. The argument escalated quickly, and at one point she even raised her hand as if she was about to slap me. That's when Zeus, normally so friendly, started growling fiercely, baring his teeth and glaring at her. The woman quickly lowered her hand and stormed off, but that moment solidified the bond between Zeus and me. He had stood up for me, just as I had always stood up for him. But one day, after a long and stressful shift at work, I came home to find that Zeus wasn't waiting for me at the door like he always did. My heart sank. I called his name, but there was no response. Panic began to set in as I searched the house, growing more frantic with each passing second. Zeus was nowhere to be found. Desperation took over as I tried to figure out how he could have gotten out. I checked every door and window, and that's when I noticed a small gap in the backyard fence. It was barely noticeable, but just big enough for Zeus to slip through. Fear gripped me as I ran out into the yard, calling his name. I raced up and down the street, knocking on neighbors' doors, asking if anyone had seen him. My mind was racing, my heart pounding, as I searched for my beloved friend, hoping against hope that I would find him safe and sound. I noticed the elderly woman who lived next door standing on her porch, watering her plants. She was always outside, either tending to her garden or sitting on her porch, so if anyone had seen something, it would be her. I hurried over and asked if she had seen Zeus. She paused, then nodded, saying she had seen him just moments ago by the old oak tree at the end of the street. Without wasting another second, I turned and sprinted towards the oak tree, my heart racing with hope. But when I arrived, there was nothing, no sign of Zeus. I called his name repeatedly, my voice echoing through the quiet street, but he didn't appear. I searched around the tree, checked the bushes, and even peered into nearby yards, but still nothing. Frustrated and desperate, I made my way back to the elderly woman's house. I needed more details. What did the dog look like? I asked, hoping for a better description. She hesitated before admitting that she hadn't been wearing her glasses at the time. Her vision wasn't clear, and she couldn't say for certain if it had been Zeus. My heart sank as I knocked on the doors of my other neighbors, asking if anyone had seen Zeus, but no one had. Tears welled up in my eyes as the fear and frustration became overwhelming. I knew I needed to calm down and think clearly, but the thought of losing Zeus forever was unbearable. The cold dread of realizing he was out there somewhere, alone and scared, settled over me like a heavy weight. Night fell, and I was still out searching for him. I called out his name into the darkness, but there was no response. Exhaustion began to set in, but I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining Zeus out there in the cold, possibly hurt or lost, and I couldn't shake the guilt I felt for not noticing the gap in the fence earlier, for not keeping him safe. The next morning, I printed out flyers with Zeus's picture and distributed them all over the neighborhood. I called every shelter and veterinary office in the area, hoping that anyone, had found him. But as the days passed, there was no word. Zeus had vanished, and I was heartbroken. The house felt so empty without him. I missed his little quirks, the way he'd follow me around, curl up beside me, or even chase figures on the TV screen, depending on where they were. His absence left a void that was impossible to fill, and it became hard to function without him. I couldn't believe that after everything we'd been through, after all the progress he'd made, he was just gone. But then, a week after he disappeared, I got a phone call from an unknown number. It was from a shelter about 30 miles away. Someone had found Zeus wandering the streets and brought him in. I couldn't believe it. I jumped into my car and drove to the shelter as fast as I could. When I walked in, I saw Zeus curled up in a corner, looking exhausted and dirty. He seemed so small and vulnerable, and my heart broke all over again. But when he saw me, his eyes lit up, and he struggled to his feet, wagging his tail weakly. I rushed over and scooped him up, holding him close as tears streamed down my face. He was safe. He was back. The ride home was quiet. Zeus was so tired that he just curled up in the passenger seat and slept the whole way. When we got home, I gave him a warm bath, cleaned his fur, and fed him a special meal. He ate slowly, still worn out from his ordeal, but I could see the relief in his eyes. He was home, and he knew it. After that scare, I immediately fixed up the backyard fence, making sure there were no more gaps or weak spots. I also became more vigilant with Zeus, keeping a closer eye on him whenever we were outside. The thought of losing him again was unbearable, but just as things seemed to be returning to normal, Zeus started acting strangely. He was lethargic, didn't want to eat, and appeared uncomfortable. My first thought was that he might be coming down with something, so I took him to the clinic for a full checkup. What I discovered was far worse than I had expected. Zeus had a life-threatening piece of plastic lodged in his intestines. My heart sank when I saw the X-rays. It was likely something he had swallowed while he was missing, and the only option was surgery. It had to happen fast. The thought of performing such a delicate procedure on my own dog was terrifying, but I knew I had to do it. I had saved him once before, and I was determined to save him again. That night, I prepped the surgery room, trying to stay calm. I kept telling myself that Zeus was a fighter, that he'd pulled through worse before, but as I began the surgery, the fear gnawed at me. This was different. Every cut, every stitch felt like a weight on my chest. The surgery was long and grueling, and there were moments when I doubted myself, moments when fatigue began to set in. I looked over at the clock. It was 3 a.m. I had been working on him for hours, and exhaustion was creeping in. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I slammed an energy drink and forced myself to keep going. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I removed the blockage, carefully stitched Zeus up, and then sat by his side, monitoring him closely. The hours that followed were some of the longest of my life. I barely slept, watching his vitals and praying that he'd wake up and be okay. The room was quiet, except for the steady hum of the monitors. My eyes were heavy from exhaustion, but I couldn't tear them away from him. Zeus lay so still, his tiny chest rising and falling ever so slightly. The surgery had taken everything out of both of us, and now all I could do was wait. My chest ached with anxiety. As the sun began to rise, light crept through the blinds. Zeus's eyelids twitched, and his body shifted slightly as he began to wake up. Slowly, his eyes opened, and he looked at me. He gave a soft whimper, and I felt my heart swell with relief. He was alive. He had made it through. I reached out, gently cradling his head in my hands, pulling him close. I held him tightly as he began to recover. His breathing steadied, his color improved, and after a few days he was back on his feet, wagging his tail and following me around the clinic. Zeus had done it again. He had beaten the odds, and I couldn't have been prouder. The years that followed were filled with bittersweet joy. Zeus seemed to recover, but he was slower and more tired. He was getting older. His once endless energy began to fade, and he started to slow down. His muzzle turned gray, and he spent most of his days resting in his favorite spot by the window, watching the world go by. I made sure to spend as much time with him as I could, cherishing every moment. One night, as we sat together on the couch, Zeus curled up beside me and rested his head on my lap. I petted him and whispered how much I loved him. Sometime during that very night, Zeus passed away peacefully in his sleep. When I woke up and realized he was gone, my heart broke. He had passed away, lying in his favorite position at the foot of my bed, curled up in a ball next to me. I buried Zeus in the backyard under the tree where we used to play. As I stood there in the cold winter air, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss, but I also felt gratitude for the time we had and for the joy he brought into my life. Zeus had become my family. He taught me that life is precious, and that love and loyalty are the greatest gifts of all.